Okay. Anyway, as Cindy's doing that, just a little background. In 2017, I lost a sister to cancer just out of the blue, as those sorts of things sometimes happen. It was really a difficult time. And then a year later, a brother, and they were both younger than me. So within a year of each other, I had my two siblings pass away. Bit of a shock. And then shortly after my brother, my dad's wife passed away. And immediately after that, in about 2018, my dad called and asked if Cheryl and I would come and live near him, because he was in his early 90s and ailing. And so we have spent the last 2 years at least assisting my dad through to the end of his life. It's been a long and difficult process these last few years. So that's the context, the background. This is not some theoretical topic that, a paper I wrote or a sermon that I scratched out. It's a talk that has to do with the experiences that we have in this life around dying and death, especially of people who are close to us. So let me see if I can get these slides up here now to kind of give a guide. Is that up?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
Yep.
So let me see if I can enlarge this. Okay, so this is the blurb, I think, that ended up on the website or somewhere where you guys put, where Cindy puts things. Dying, death, and the stages of spiritual growth. What I want to do this morning is tie in my own experiences of going through this stuff, this dying and death sort of phenomena, with the idea of stages of growth, that we're all many selves. That is, we have several different selves within us that express, and it's not unusual to have many different experiences because we are many different selves. As I said earlier, the dying and death of a loved one, or death in general, is seldom discussed honestly, I think, in our churches. One of my favorite instructors, mentors, James Hillman, in his book, Suicide in the Soul, which is an amazing little book, said we're always talking about life and living, but we neglect the one topic that is certain for each of us, death. Dying and death are psychological certainties and powerful spiritual experiences. And I think that first came clear to me when I lost my son in 2008 in Afghanistan, that there is a spiritual experience that takes place in dying and death, unlike any other spiritual experience. And I think a lot of people don't associate dying and death as a spiritual experience because we have sort of put a spin on spirituality as it has to be something that makes you feel good. And as I'm looking at this, I'm suggesting that in the world's literatures, from Buddhism to Christianity, Islam, Japanese religion, wherever you go, they always included death and dying as part of the spiritual experience. So that's kind of the perspective we're taking here. Most of us have very complicated and complex relationships with those people around us whom we love, parents, children, relatives, etc. And in the death and dying process of someone we're close to, it's not always pleasant. It's not always, roses and butterflies. There's some very difficult, and most of you know what I'm talking about, things that are not discussed in the eulogy at the funeral, but they're still there in the process of losing these people that we're with. So that's what we're looking at today, this Sunday. We're entering into the soul-making classroom of dying and death as we explore the many layers of emotion, thinking, and behaviors around end-of-life issues with our loved ones specifically. This is an image from Hinduism and Buddhism. This is probably the most important image in Eastern spirituality. That's Yama, the god of death, holding the samsara wheel, which is the entire cosmos, the entire universe, is held in the hands of death. You see the skulls and the crown on top of the head of Yama, with 2 hands and 2 feet wrapped around this ball. The Hindus recognize that this world in which we live has a single certainty for all of us, and that is death is part of the wheel of life. Most certain aspects of living, in fact. So what I want to talk about here, as I mentioned earlier, is death and our multiple selves. That is this experience of death and dying and being many different selves. I think one of the dangers of using the term unity, which we, spiritual folks like to use a lot. We like to be unity, unified, one, whole, all that. Good, great, wonderful. However, the danger is it can cause us to think that we ought to always be in a state of unity, that we ought to always be in a state of consistency in our personality. And I'm going to argue that when you look at the world's religions and spirituality, unity is not the only mode of consciousness we are supposed to experience. We are also supposed to experience disintegration and multiplicity. Unity may be the goal. As I write here, unity is the goal, but the soul-making process, that is, each of us is being made into something, a unique soul, requires a multiplicity of selves as we go through experiences of death and dying. So we're going to have multiple experiences. Each of us has many egos in this view. In other words, it's not just the ego. There are many egos. And just a quick review, we've looked at this here with you all several times, but just a review. Here are our many selves, and I'm going to talk this morning about how I went through these many selves or these many egos in the death of the ones around me. First of all, each of us is an ego, and I'm suggesting God is ego, that part of us that is I, that is me, that is self, even self-centered. It's all about me. This is a mode of consciousness. We live in it every day. It's normal. It's natural. It's part of the process. I must have a healthy ego, and sometimes it's not healthy. I must know and live my personal identity and call. That's my ego. And ego is not enough. I have another perspective, and each of us does, and that is our tribal or partisan or relationship perspectives. This is God as well. This is where we join into relationships with other people, with family, friends, political parties, whatever groups we belong to. This is a necessary way of looking at life. So I not only see life through the eyes of I also see life through the eyes of we every day. I must have relationships. I must care for these relationships and take stands on issues with my group, my people. And human relationships, just like the ego's not enough, human relationships are not enough. So we have a third mode of consciousness. Not only do we see through the eyes of me and the eyes of we also see daily through the eyes of disintegration. And I'm suggesting, if you look at all the world's mythologies and Bible, etc., that God is part of the disintegration. There's a disintegrative aspect to God. So each of us disintegrates. We have those thoughts every single day where things fall apart. We worry, we fear, we go into all these disintegrations. And I'm suggesting this is necessary. We must fall apart and suffer losses, and that those experiences of grief and sadness that come with loss. We must move through these emotional crises in the state of consciousness. This is the most uncomfortable stage or mode. But don't get stuck in this stage. It's necessary, but don't get stuck in it, because there's a fourth stage that we go through every day. Mystical experiences, and this is the one most of us tend to camp out in. It's like, this is the one I want to be in all the time. But the fact is, every single day we are in ego, we are in relationships, we are in disintegration, as well as that unified mystical part of us. In this unified mystical part, the divine good will touch me. I will feel what I call the good presence of God. I will feel reintegration taking place. Something's coming together. The unity is working. And I have faith that it is working. So what I'm suggesting is, this is how soul making or spirit creation works. It works through having these four kinds of experiences. Let me emphasize this. All four of these experiences are necessary for every part of this life. Ego relationships, me, we relationships, disintegrating relationships, and wholeness in our relationships. As Walt Whitman said in the Song of Myself, which is an autobiographical poem that he wrote, he asked the question, do I contradict myself? Because this is the way it feels when we move in and out of these different modes of consciousness. Like, who am I? 10 minutes ago, everything was just so perfect. And now everything just feels like it's falling apart. He said, do I contradict myself? Very well, then, I contradict myself. I am large. I contain multitudes. So these four modes, these four ways of seeing and experiencing life feel like contradictions in us at times. In fact, they can drive us a little bit crazy because we don't feel like we're as consistent as we, quote unquote, ought to be. Now, what I want to do with this is look at Jesus. We could do this in many different ways, but look at Jesus and the four attitudes he had toward death and dying. He had all four of these attitudes we just discussed. Jesus had an ego attitude at his death, and we're going to see that. Jesus had a tribal or a partisan or relationship attitude toward death and dying, where it included not just his own ego, but the people around him. Jesus had a disintegrative experience with death, where he fell apart. And then finally, Jesus had the mystical experience with death, where he trusted that it was all God. So let's look at these and see how they, kind of fit into our own experiences of dying and death. First of all, the ego mode. In the ego mode, typically, I am terrified of death and dying. It scares me. The thought of not being around anymore, or the thought of the loved one that is with me every day, suddenly just literally the switch is flipped and they're gone, is terrifying in the ego mode. I exist in this mode, and the thought of my non-existence can be absolutely horrifying. We find this in Luke 22 with Jesus as he is in the Garden of Gethsemane just before his arrest and trial and crucifixion. He knows that he may be about to die. And here's what we read. Jesus went out as usual to the Mount of Olives. This is a garden outside of Jerusalem where he went out to pray, kind of a park, if you will. And his disciples followed him. On reaching the place where he wanted to pray, he said to them, "Pray that you will not fall into temptation." Jesus withdrew about a stone's throw beyond the disciples. Jesus knelt down and he prayed, and here's what he said, "Father, if you are willing, take this cup of suffering from me." Being in anguish, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat was like drops of blood falling to the ground. Now, this one little verse essentially is saying there was an experience in Jesus as he was certain that he might be facing execution for his treason, was terrified, and he didn't want to die. Take this cup from before me. So this is a mode of consciousness that's common in death and dying. And when we're around family members or somebody that we may be caring for, let them be in this mode of consciousness. Let them be in this mode without rescuing them. Pray for them. That's what Jesus asked for his disciples. Pray for me, but he didn't say, come over and sit with me and tell me how I should feel. So this experience in death and dying, terror, is perfectly normal. My dad, as I was with him these last 2 years, almost daily, and he was 93, 94 these last 2 years, and he was very, very ill. And every once in a while, he would just look at me and say, "I'm scared. I'm scared. I love life and I want more." I don't know if I've ever known a person who wanted more of life than he did. He held on to every second of life. So this is the first mode of consciousness. It's okay to be afraid of dying. Secondly, Jesus, after that experience of falling apart in the garden and asking God to remove the cup of suffering and death from him, there's a second mode of consciousness, the ego or the tribal mode. I want to leave a legacy. I want to help others through my life and through my death. Here's what Jesus said about that. "This is my commandment." He's speaking to his disciples. "This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this, that she lay down her life for their friends." Now, this is all through the Gospels that Jesus saw not only was death and dying something to be feared in the ego, death and dying also includes a mode of consciousness where we have thoughts of, what am I leaving for my family? What have I, what can I give the people around me through this experience of death and dying? My dad, as I was with him, shared several times that the main reason he worked so hard and saved money and all that he did was to leave a legacy for his children and grandchildren. He said that many times. That was very important to him. And it's a very normal experience. When we're with people in our family who are going through the death or the dying process, let them talk about this. Again, we don't need to ameliorate anything or try to fix them or counsel them. Just recognize and listen as they talk about, what they want to do and are trying to do for the people around them. When I was over in Bainbridge a few years ago on working with the group over there, a retired man, a writer and educator who went all around the world and spoke, came to me one day and privately confessed that he felt he was not leaving an adequate legacy. And he didn't want me to counsel him or tell him anything. He just wanted to share with me his concerns about what he was leaving behind, where he had failed in his life as a father, as a husband, as a friend. This is normal at the end of life, to come and talk about failures and successes as they relate to our relationships. Let it happen. It's normal. My son, Jason, who was killed in 2008, expresses this idea of legacy, leaving something behind, death meaning more than just, it's all about me. In the last letter that he wrote home, and I want to read part of it to you here to show this mode of soul making, that our death and the dying process includes others. He wrote in 2008, about 2 weeks before he was killed, he said, "I feel my days are numbered." All the guys who were there knew they were in a bad situation. He said, "So I want to say all this while I can. I pray to God no one will ever have to read this, but as death is all around me, if it falls upon me, you will understand my recent feelings on this madness we call life. My views and outlook on life seem to be drastically changing recently. As many of you saw before I left, when I quit drinking, I was just starting to live my life. Never have I felt as strong as I do about what I'm doing here in Afghanistan as the right thing for me to be doing, as understood and accepted by my God. As a result of that, death is easier to accept. Being back here in Afghanistan is exactly where I'm supposed to be and where I want to be. I feel I'm doing more good over here than I was as an electrician. When he was in the States, that was his vocation. I knew exactly what I was doing when I re-enlisted as infantry. I'm just sorry that you all have to suffer for it now. Know that you all are the reason I'm here to give my life, for that is nothing to me. My love for every one of you is what drives me and brings me comfort under stressful situations." Now, the issue in this letter is not about his situation or the war or any particular war or any particular conflict in general. It's just an example of how there is a natural mode in each of us when it comes to dying and death that wants to leave something behind for others. Let it be. It's part of us. Thirdly, the third motive, besides ego and tribal when it comes to dying death, a natural mode of consciousness is analytical and pathologizing. That is, I don't know what I believe happens after death can be part of the experience. By pathologizing, I mean suffering, deep personal suffering in the face of death. Feelings of divine abandonment and even feelings of anger are natural. Jesus on the cross says this, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And we could talk about this in some detail, but what we see for certain here is that Jesus had a moment where he felt abandoned by the divine presence. This is so normal for people who are in the midst of death and dying. Over the last 2 years, there were a few times, very deep times, when my dad would ask, one day he asked me, he says, Michael, do you really believe there is life after death? And we had a big conversation about that. He said, I'm not so sure. He was a strong, bold Christian man. He shared his faith with others. He had probably one of the strongest Christians I've ever known. But I witnessed in him, in the moments of his dying process, deep doubt and questioning. There were a couple of times he said, I'm not sure I believe anymore. C.S. Lewis, in his book, A Grief Observed, watched his wife slowly die of cancer, and he wrote a journal, basically, of the process. And in this observation of his own grief process, he said there was a time he lost his faith. This is normal, very normal. So if we're around people, you're around people, or even in our own processes, don't let it overwhelm us that there will be those modes, those moments when we're just not sure any of this is true. This is a normal and necessary stage and mode of soul-making consciousness, maybe the most neglected, in my opinion. Oftentimes what happens when we're around people going through this questioning, this deep questioning, is we try to reassure them. I'm not saying that's wrong, but I'm wondering if it's not at times just okay to let them express it and to go through it without us trying to prop them up. The Spirit of God has this amazing way of taking people apart and putting them back together without our counseling and advice. Number 4 and last, there is that mystical mode of consciousness in dying and death. This is what we usually associate with spirituality. And I agree with that, but I'm suggesting also that the other 3 stages are part of the spiritual process as well. A deep, abiding trust in God in this mode and feelings of assurance of life beyond death. This is the one most of us like to see and have. This is where I see that there is something greater than me involved in this death and dying process. Jesus on the cross experienced this when he said, after he said, my God, why have you forsaken me? Immediately he says, Father, into your hands I release my spirit. And then it says, he died. My dad, most of the time, would express his trust in Christ as his Lord and Savior. This was his anchor or his rootedness in truth, his lifeline. He had strong feelings. Some days it was overwhelming, the state of mystical experience he was in the midst of dying. And many of us have seen this in others as well. It's astonishing to see how the presence of God can be there so deeply in those times of pain. When I lost my son, I'd never had the presence of God in such a deep way as I did during some of those days after Jason's death. My wife's mom last year passed away as well. So like I said, this has been a couple of years of just a lot of loss for us. And the times I was with her, I don't know that I've ever seen a more consistent person in their trust in Christ. As she was dying of cancer and in a lot of pain, she would whisper to me, I am in the presence of Jesus Christ. This was her affirmation. This is also a mode of consciousness. So in summary, I'll close it up here. I'm suggesting that we have many different selves. As Gurdjieff, the European Russian mystic, said, humans have no individual ego. But there are instead hundreds and thousands of separate small I's, very often entirely unknown to one another, never coming into contact, or on the contrary, hostile sometimes to each other, mutually exclusive and incompatible. This is similar to Whitman's comment, do I contradict myself? Gurdjieff is saying it's not unusual in experiences in this life to have contradictory feelings. Each minute, each moment, every person is saying or thinking I, and each time his or her I is different. Just now it was a thought, now a desire, now a sensation, now another thought, and so on, endlessly. A human is a plurality. Man's name is Legion. So we end with this slide that we started with, that this cosmos is in the grip of a god named Yama, or death. And you see up in the head of Yama that there is that third eye. Even in death, there is a third eye, which is that eye of seeing through the pain and all of that to a higher spiritual purpose. So I'm suggesting it's normal to have many attitudes, emotions, and experiences around death and dying, whether it's our own process or we're with others in their process. Let them have their many experiences. Our church needs to make room for this. Our churches need to make room for this, not always try to prop people up, but let them go through these different experiences. As we're with our loved ones, allow them to move in and out of these moods as their souls are being made. Again, I'm seeing this as all these different chiselings and chippings and sculptings of the hand of God is showing up in many different forms. They're all required. So the final affirmation is that there is deep soul-making purpose in end-of-life matters, often the most difficult to deal with. And I think I'll close it there. So if anybody has any comments or questions, let's take a couple of minutes and see what you have to say.
I'll go ahead and unmute everybody.
All right, you've been unmuted. You can now speak.
Michael, Tracy Loop here.
Hi, Tracy.
Hi. I had a near-death experience, and it changed me forever.
Yeah.
I will never look at death quite as much now that I did before my near-death experience.
Mm-hmm.
It was very powerful.
Did you experience different kinds of emotions through that whole process?
No, not really. I did after the process and talking about it and thinking about the symbolism that was there and everything that had happened. I did go through a lot of emotion afterwards.
Well, that's what I mean by the process. The whole.
Oh yeah, I did.
The whole thing.
Yes.
Yeah. And what I'm suggesting is that all of those are necessary and legitimate. Thank you, Tracy.
You're welcome, Michael.
Anyone else?
Should I share my mom's? No, maybe not.
Yeah. Mr. Colin Campbell. Did you have something?
Hi.
Hi, Michael. It's Colin and Barbara.
Hi, you guys.
Hi. Hey, I was just going to share briefly. I was very fortunate, even though I was in, traveling actually up through Montana and then Idaho, and my daughter lived in Idaho. And as my mom was passing and I got word, and she was in Arizona, where I grew up, my daughter and my two younger granddaughters were able to catch a flight from Spokane to Phoenix, and we made it up there to Prescott in time to be with her for 5 days. And my brother drove over from the LA area, and it was one of the most amazing. I mean, I'm so glad I was able to be there. What a party we sent her off with. I mean, just totally in the presence, sharing stories, singing together, poems, talking with her, hugging her. Even though she seemed not to be all that aware, we could tell she would try to smile or squeeze our hand.
Mm-hmm.
And, giving her permission that it was okay. We were going to be okay.
Yeah.
That she'd done great things for us, and it's okay for her to move on when she was ready. And wow, what an experience. It was beautiful.
Yeah, that's a great story. Thank you. Anyone else?
Michael, this is Colin.
Yeah.
I've had two people pass away recently. One from COVID. He passed away quickly. He was a denier of it all. And the other one was a pancreatic cancer. Both of them went in 3 days.
Wow.
And first, I wanted to thank you for sharing this because it is a tough subject. I was lucky somehow in my teenage, adolescent years, I came across some kind of acceptance of death. I'm not so afraid of death.
Mm.
I say that now, but I'm not seeing it.
Mhm.
But what I wanted to say is thank you for sharing this, because it helps in coping.
Yeah.
And kind of, we don't really compare or contrast, but it's knowing that others are in this too. Thank you for sharing.
Yes, and thank you for that. I mean, what I found with being with my dad this last 2 years is you can never really prepare for it. You just do the best you can to prepare, and then you go through the experience and learn.
Yeah, because it's going to happen.
Michael, this is Joy.
Hi, Joy.
Good morning. Hey, what I'm finding interesting, and I liked how it was all laid out, concrete, sequential for us there, is that those stages are applicable not just to death, but to all various death experiences like retirement, changing your
Everything.
job. You're
Yep.
going to have to sell your house. I was out yesterday in my garden and my tomatoes have blight. There was moments where I was going through oh God, no, not my tomatoes. And I, had, I've been working so hard. Okay, I'm letting you go. And I'm like, geez, Joy, really get a life here. But at the same time,
Yeah.
I'm going, or I just retired. But at the same time, I'm doing all those different steps that you presented about how it relates to me, how it relates to my friends, my tribe.
Yeah.
Then those moments of, fill in the blank nasty word there. And then finally letting go, and yes, it will be okay. So it's just not death, it's all these things we can do.
That's right. That's exactly right. That's, in this culture, we spend so much time talking about unity and wholeness, and which is good, but sometimes we don't allow for the diversity that's within our own consciousness to just be there.
So, Michael, here's a question for you. I did a lot of hospice volunteering, and I've definitely had my share of death experiences since I was really young. But what I found really interesting when I started the hospice volunteering is the fear, which would sometimes, it was just really sad how scared people were, but they oftentimes weren't scared of dying, but they were scared of the pain
Yes.
that they felt were associated. But why is it that some people have a horrible, excruciating, long drawn out, painful experience, and others, boom, all of a sudden, oh, gone?
Yep. Are you asking me why?
Yeah, what are your thoughts?
There's a quick answer there. I have no clue. I have thought about it, and that's one of the reasons I like James Hillman's work is he explores, the Greek idea of the daemon, and you find it in other religions as well. Each of us comes into this world with assignments, and for some, like my son, was killed instantly. I mean, he was shot and killed instantly, they said. 25, no suffering. My mom went through a year. My dad, the last 2 years. Hillman suggests that each of us comes into this world with assignments on our lesson book, and for some, that calls for the long process in the classroom of death and dying. For others, it's a very short class.
Mhm.
So that's the best answer I've got, and ultimately, I have no clue. I'm hoping for the quick, but
Me too. Anybody else want to share something with Michael? Jamie?
No, I'm just listening.
all right. Well, if there's no one else, we'll turn it over to Cindy. And
Thank you, Michael.
thank you.
Yes. Thank you, Michael, very much.
Thank you.